if we can, I think one of the most important things about convenings and collaboration is communication. So if you're sitting at a table and you don't know everybody at the table already, please take a second to say hi to them, introduce yourself. And as the day goes on, please meet one another throughout the day. It's a very important thing for us to not only collaborate, but we cannot collaborate if we do not communicate. My name is Marcos Morales. I'm the chairman of the board of the Alliance to Close the Racial Wealth Gap. The Alliance to Close the Racial Wealth Gap is actually the brainchild of a gentleman that some of you may know, Al Pena. Al Pena formed a couple of organizations. He was a champion for addressing the if you would, the disrespect that the communities of color were getting from a variety of different banks and other parties that just were not paying attention to what we were doing. And so he started on a mission, and you guys may or may not know, he used to do hunger strikes in front of banks. And the banks would say, what is going on? Why are we doing this? Why is this man in front of my building? But at the end of the day, when they went and asked him personally, they created a relationship. And they realized that he was fighting for the right cause, a cause that improves and benefits them. And so they decided that, hey, this is something we need to do. And some years back, he recruited me, and he recruited others in the room. And him and John Gamboa, that you guys might know, have been working together forever in the green lining space and other space. And so he took that green lining experience to Florida and created the FMCRC, the Florida Minority Community Reinvestment Cooperative. And when he died, he asked me and a couple of others, Dina Harris, Marcia Griffin, who's in the room, John Gamboa, Adam Briones, asked us, would you guys carry this torch? It's a heavy lift. It's a hard road to tow, but somebody has to do it or else our community will never get addressed. So we formed this alliance to close the racial wealth gap. And the purpose of the alliance, of course, we currently have 66 members. So if you're in here and you're not a member and you want to be a member, there's back there by Soraya is one of these little flyers, and there's a barcode. Scan it, and please become a member. If you really, really want to change this condition that our country's in, the housing crisis is beyond where it should be. It's beyond crisis. It's chronic now. It continues to be chronic, and it will not get improved unless we address it. So the Alliance to End the Racial Wealth Gap, our mission is to, let me read this directly because John changed it on me again. Is to address the growing wealth gap plaguing our lower and moderate income communities by increasing national home supply and housing supply. And what's the difference between home and housing, right? Housing, as you all know, the vast majority of the billions of dollars that are being invested in affordable housing is going into affordable rental housing. The largest gap in our country is home ownership housing opportunities for our low to moderate income communities and families and individuals. And so that's what this is about. And that's what this convening is about. This convening is about creating and working together in collaboration to create and increase the housing supply. And so before I add to that, I would like to spend a minute to introduce our board members. Our board members, I'll start over here. We have Brian Townsend. Of course, John Gamboa is not on the board, but he runs everything, so that's John Gamboa. You guys know John quite well, I hope. You guys know Marcia Griffin, Home for USA. Adam Briones over here. I feel, where's Julius? Oh, no, Julius, you're not on the board, right? Julius is, I'm sorry. Julius is preparing and setting up our corporate advisory board, a board of bank members and bankers across the country so that we can further this. Oh, and Natalie, I knew you were here somewhere. I was looking for you. I was like, where's Natalie Aguilera? Natalie's on our board. And not here today is Dina Harris. I won't tell you why she's not here. I want to because it's kind of a funny story, but she might get mad at me. If any of you have any interest, let me know, and I'll tell you personally outside. And then, of course, Pastor Alonzo Bell was not able to join us today either. So this alliance, again, is laser focused on increasing the housing supply. And I see, I see HUD, I see Unidos US, I see NeighborWorks, I see the ABA, I see a lot of folks whose housing issues are probably number one in all of their thought process. If it's not number one, it's pretty close to being the number one issue. And we heard at the debate the other day, Vice President Kamala Harris said when she wins the office, in her first term, she will create 3 million new housing opportunities. And so for me, that deserves some applause because we need that. We need that, right? So having said that, today's convening, we have some fabulous panelists in this room. You guys are going to hear a lot of important information about this housing supply shortage. The one thing that I can say is that everybody is looking at cost of construction. Everybody's looking at the creation of new housing stock, which is fine and well and important and necessary. But what a lot of people are not looking at is what is happening already with existing housing stock. And so in the existing housing stock market, the GSEs, if you know, are selling a lot of their inventory, and a lot of that inventory is going primarily to hedge funds. And then they're turning them into rental portfolios, and then those rental portfolios are choking out the home ownership opportunities and driving the rental rates up. So that said, HUD, on the other hand, has done a thing where they have a nonprofit only set aside for the same types of assets. And they allow nonprofits like mine and others to buy these assets and convert them into home ownership opportunities and not rental portfolios for these large hedge funds. So hopefully we'll get to address some of that. And thank you. David here is from HUD, by the way, and he's been very instrumental in making sure that that kind of stuff happens. So I welcome all of you. Please get to know one another. And I will now hand it off to my friend Brian Townsend.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I'm so excited to be here with you. I publish newspapers in Southern California, so I'm not really in the housing industry as most of you are here. But I believe in the mission of the Alliance, and that's why I've come aboard. We're doing what we can to build housing stock. We've done so much to try and create access to capital and find ways to get people into houses, but we're finding that we don't have enough houses to give to them. So we've got to build housing stock, and the Alliance members have been advocating, and we're trying to bring Alliance members in to join us in this effort. It's such a big effort to go around the country and find ways to build housing stock. And so yesterday we had a gathering of meetings with Maxine Waters. We met with the FDIC. We met with the Hispanic Caucus and others. So we're trying to do the work, and we want you to help join us doing that work, because a handful of people can't do all of that. This is a major mission. It's really an impossible mission, but we're all excited to be part of that mission. Because if we're all doing good things in our communities that we serve, and this is another way of adding to the legacy that you guys are creating for yourselves, because you're doing such good work, and we're still finding that there are so many people in need. We're doing all this work, but we don't see the difference in our communities, and we're trying to see that difference. And when we start building that generational wealth and the home ownership that brings that to the table, we'll see that our work has been for a reason. So we've created I haven't even seen it yet, but we've created a little film document, a little video, so that when we reach out to people about the Alliance, about joining us and finding out what we do, so we'd like to introduce that video and get your reaction to that. Let us know how it is. Like I said, I haven't seen it, so whoever's rolling the video, please roll the video, and welcome everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties, obviously. We're still going to wait and see if we can make that work, though. Okay, so I don't know the next steps because I don't have an agenda in front of me. But let me say this, the reason we're here, this is a convening. We're trying to figure out, like you at your local levels, what can we do to build housing stock? And if we can come together, we can create public policy. We can look at how we can support each other in your local jurisdictions for zoning issues. You know, we want to find ways that are what's working for you in your communities so that we can replicate that. What's not working in your communities, and how can we replicate that? If you're a financial institution that's created these commitments, you know, for example, I don't want to name names, but one bank has like 18 commitments to help build wealth in our communities. So if they're being hindered, because I want that to work, that's a home run to me. So let's get those 18 commitments done. And if you're bringing access to capital in my community, I want that to work. So if you're having a hard time, what can we do to go to legislators or the state legislators or local communities to help you get rid of those hindrances? So we need you to help us develop those kinds of strategies, those kinds of ways to find new ways of conquering this effort. And so I want to welcome you to for that reason. I'm looking forward to the ideas that you will bring to the table and your excitement and your work to make this happen. And I'll turn this back over to either Marcos or whoever wants to take it to the next step. It's Adam Briones, my hero. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Marcos. I'll go ahead and say, could you raise your hand if you've ever been at an event where the video goes right the first time? Because I do know, I'm not that old, but I've never been at an event where the video actually works the first time. So appreciate everybody being flexible with us. My name's Adam Briones. I'm CEO of California Community Builders. We're an organization that works to close the racial wealth gap using housing and home ownership as our primary tool. And today, I'm really excited. I actually think I have the best job today because I get to facilitate two amazing panels on housing supply throughout the country. And not just is the topic interesting, we have some of the foremost leaders in the space, some folks representing organizations that frankly started the fight around housing supply and making sure we have enough homes in the modern era. We have folks leading the charge on making sure that people of color have access to capital to buy a home. We have folks at the local level providing the housing counseling and information needed to actually connect families to those loans. So I just think we have a really great program today. And before I invite our first panelists up, I do know that we have a lot of folks that have traveled to come to us today, some from not as far and some from quite far. So if I could get a quick clap, who's based here in DC? Okay, very good. All right, so we got our DC folks. Who here is from a East Coast state but not DC? Okay. Who came from California? All right, look at that. Excited Westerners. We love to see it. So okay, and who here is from the Midwest? All right. So first off, I'd like to invite up our first panel. So if I could have Eli, Laura, Gillian, and Hyepin come join me on the stage here. And if we could give a quick clap before I introduce everybody. And sit wherever you like. 3 and 2. Yeah. And every seat is a VIP seat, so yeah. Hyepin, why don't you come up and sit next to me? All right, everybody. So with this panel, we're really going to be focused on state-level issues. For anyone that's familiar with the conversation and advocacy around increasing housing supply, you know that really some of the biggest problems right now are at the local and state level. As a Californian, my organization, CCB, does a lot of work on statewide legislation to make it easier to build homes for working families. And so what this panel is going to do is really talk about what are some of the issues happening in all 50 states with a focus on a few states to make it easier to build homes, to make it easier for families to have an affordable rent, to make it easier for families to have an affordable mortgage. So before I get into it, I would like to welcome our first panelist, Eli Kahn, who's actually Let's see, one of two Bay Area, or actually counting me, one of three Bay Area natives today, so I'm very excited for that. Eli is a research assistant at the Mercatus Center and is doing some of the foremost research on these issues of housing supply here in the country. Originally from San Francisco, Eli has a master's in public policy from UC Berkeley, has previously worked for the Oakland Chamber of Commerce, and is someone who's really, really passionate about cities and doing some really great work and research around that. So Eli, without further ado, if I could hand it over to you.
Thanks, Adam. So I work at the Mercatus Center. We're a research institute affiliated with George Mason University, and we do a lot of work studying efforts that state policymakers are doing to kind of overturn the exclusionary local zoning that really over the years has kind of pulled out like the bottom rungs of the ladder of homeownership, where now like there's no way to get from renting to that top layer that's the only thing available. So there are all these efforts all the way across the country, really in every state. I don't know if...
You know what, Eli, let's see. Why don't we do this? Let me go ahead and... Oh, here we go. There we go. Eli, you stand wherever you like.
We make it work.
We make it work, yeah.
Okay, so...
You
and
might
then...
have to go to the
Why don't you go
front.
down?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Be amongst the people.
Yeah.
Yes. So so this map is basically just a composite of all of the states that have enacted some kind of law over the past 2 years to overturn local zoning laws. And you see that it's really across the country, especially in these high-cost western states, and some in New England as well, but there's really bipartisan movement in red states, blue states, purple states. And if I could get the next slide. So I'm going to kind of divide the policies that states have worked on into three broad areas. And this is really more of a mnemonic than a strict division, but there's things that help with what you can build, things that help with where you can build, and things that help limit what they can stop. So local zoning really takes a lot of forms, and local governments over the years have really gotten very finely tuned in terms of what they regulate. There are height limits like we have here in DC. There are required setbacks from the street. There are requirements in some neighborhoods for aesthetics, saying you can only build something that looks like what's already there. And there aren't a lot of state policymakers saying, all right, no more height limits, no more setback limits. There are a few examples, like in Iowa this year, there was a law that prohibits local governments from setting requirements on the exterior materials. But to go to the next slide, one special area that deserves particular attention is these parking minimums. It's almost universal for local governments to set requirements on how many parking spaces you have to add per unit of housing, or for commercial properties as well, that are often not really based on science. It's just kind of a mandate, and they make it harder to build more units because that's space that you can't rent out. It can't be filled except by a car, and it's not necessarily related to the need for parking. So there is kind of a local movement, there's kind of a grassroots movement to get rid of these parking minimums altogether, but what we see most of the time is that policymakers in states are limiting them, especially near transit, where we know there are car alternatives available. And we see that for this year in Colorado, for instance, which passed a big package of reforms, part of which was removing these parking minimums near transit in the metropolitan area. And also there was a law in Maryland, for instance, that limits parking minimums in Baltimore. And staying on the subject of what you can build, an emerging area that people are thinking about more and more is thinking about how what you can build is limited not just by local zoning, but also by the building code, which is the next slide. Thank you. So this is really kind of an emerging new area, but people are wondering whether, these regulations are really serving the best purpose of safety and accessibility that they're supposed to be for. So one very new area of policy change is throughout most of the United States, multi-story buildings have to be built with 2 staircases for fire safety. But in a lot of the world, in Europe, for instance, multi-story buildings up to 6 stories can be built with a single staircase, and there are other fire safety regulations that deliver equivalent fire safety. So a lot of states this year, this has really taken off very fast, Tennessee, Connecticut, California, Virginia, Minnesota have been passing bills to direct the state building council to see if there's any way to implement that and maybe make some cheaper, narrower buildings with the same fire safety. And now that that has kind of shown promise, people are also asking questions about other similar issues with regard to, for instance, elevators in the United States tend to be much bigger and more expensive than elevators in Europe, and people are asking the question of, is that well adapted to the safety needs? And another way in which the building code comes into play is that many local governments have ordinances that restrict manufactured housing, even though HUD has regulations for what is livable, structurally sound manufactured housing. And so some states like New Hampshire this year have taken action to make sure that those local governments permit any manufactured housing that complies with that HUD code. So the next broad area that I'll get into is where you can build. And again, these are kind of not mutually exclusive. It's more of just a mnemonic to keep track of things. So there are ways to add more density, and one of the ways that a lot of people are thinking about is this idea of missing middle. A lot of the neighborhoods that have been historically most exclusionary, a lot of what you see are now the wealthiest neighborhoods, the places that were, on the old maps that were green lined or blue. Those are often restricted to single family homes only on large lots. So some policymakers have been thinking about how can we add in more housing that's, not necessarily giant apartment buildings, but is townhouses, duplexes, just things on smaller lots. And so, for instance, that's been popular in California, in Minnesota, in Arlington, Virginia, lots of places. And the idea is if you let local governments still restrict kind of the aesthetics to make it look like what's currently there, then maybe there will be less resistance. But unfortunately, we do still see a lot of resistance. There have been some lawsuits in Minnesota and Montana. So that's one front on which the fight for more housing supply is advancing, but it I think has maybe turned out more controversial than people were hoping. Another question of where you can build is, could we put more housing in what had previously been commercial districts? This is very attractive for a lot of people because we see a lot of downtowns being vacated, a lot of office buildings being vacated with the switch to remote work and with the pandemic. And another advantage politically of creating more housing, of letting more housing be built in commercial zones is there aren't as many neighbors to complain. So with the missing middle, it's a lot of these neighbors who are complaining. In the commercial districts, not necessarily. But these office to residential conversions are very expensive, for one thing. And if you look at examples like Florida, which I think had the biggest one of these laws last year, the Live Local Act, that law allows housing really broadly in commercial districts, but it doesn't exempt industrial districts. So I think there's then kind of a question of environmental justice where if you're letting people build as much housing as they want in industrial districts that may have pollution issues, but you're not opening up those exclusionary single-family home districts, that's maybe steering development in the wrong direction. And the Florida Live Local Act also had some issues where it tied the maximum height and density to the most dense area in the surrounding area, so that kind of incentivizes the local governments to lower those limits. So that was an issue with that law specifically. And people are also talking about maybe allowing faith communities and other nonprofits to build housing on their land, which is sort of also kind of a new emerging policy area, and it really is going to look different based on whether you see it as protecting the viability of some of those faith communities going forward in terms of letting them sell off parcels of their land, or if you see it as protecting their religious freedom to provide affordable and housing in accordance with their mission. And so then the most popular tactic for letting people build more is letting homeowners add accessory dwelling units on their property. And this, I think, really you see the most state laws. This is really kind of the most popular policy area. There's so many states that have introduced and passed ADU bills. And one of the advantages here is, a lot of homeowners benefit from this. It allows kind of multi-generational living. It allows people who maybe want to live close to an elderly parent or a young adult child. It allows them to provide a housing unit for those people. And it also is a vehicle for those homeowners to build wealth. It's a way for the homeowners to, create maybe a rental unit on their property and build up their wealth that way. And what we've seen, particularly in California, is that ADUs, after the laws in California, have been a huge part of the new housing construction in California. The pitfall with ADU laws is that if you're just a homeowner, you don't have, an army of lawyers. If City Hall wants to put obstacles in your way or create all of these loopholes that make it hard to get permitted, then there's not much you can do, and you just have to kind of give up. So, for instance, there are rules saying you have to add parking. There are rules making the permitting process more difficult. There are rules saying it can't be rental housing. It has to be just for seniors or for a member of your family. And there are rules saying, for instance, it has to be a detached structure and can't be a garage conversion or something like that. And fortunately, I think that we see states getting better at kind of getting ahead of these loopholes and closing them. I think Arizona's ADU law from this year, HB 2720, is a particularly good example of really listing a whole bunch of things that the local governments are not allowed to put in your way if you want to build an ADU, like those parking requirements and things like that. So then the third broad area that states are really looking at is, what can they stop? And I think this is really an emerging, maybe consensus is maybe too ambitious a word to use, but I think there's more and more people are thinking that no matter what you are allowed on paper to build, if there is a confusing process, if there are all these steps in the process and all of these places where people can intervene to stop it, that really kills a lot of the housing production that you would otherwise have. And, I think that this is also, from my perspective, I think an equity issue where if you look at who gets to build and who gets to be in the development business, when you have all these obstacles, when you need a whole bunch of lawyers to get anything built, it's the people who have that capital, it's the people who have, those connections in City Hall. So it's going to be the legacy developers, and it's not going to be new business owners. It's not going to be people who don't have those legacy connections. So there are a lot of policy ideas on the table to make these local permitting processes simpler and easier to understand. It's really such a big area, and there's not one single idea that dominates. But there are some policies that would create time limits on where if you submit your paperwork and the local government hasn't taken any action in 60 days, the permits issue automatically. There are reforms that sort of limit how many of the neighbors get to sue to stop the development from going forward. So there are all of these different ideas. And as you can see from that list of states, there's really a lot of states looking at different policy ideas. And so on the next slide, another way of going about this is something that really has a storied history, especially in New Jersey with its Mount Laurel court case, which has been in place since the 1970s. There are ways for the state government to say to tell the local governments, not only do you have to engage in long-term planning, but you are going to be accountable for changing your land use to accommodate your projected share of regional growth in housing, including your projected share of regional growth in affordable, subsidized housing. So that's, as I said, that's been a big part of the strategy in New Jersey over the years. It's also an increasing part of the strategy in California with its regional housing needs allocation process that increasingly is getting ratcheted up. And I think this is a big part of the strategy for a lot of states. And the only pitfall there is that it can be sort of polarizing. The state government ends up fighting the local governments kind of tooth and nail. They end up trying to designate inappropriate sites for housing or find ways to wriggle out of their obligations. So it ends up being a strategy that you have to really commit to. So with all of this information, that really raises the obvious question, just on the next slide. So what is the one best strategy? And unfortunately, there's no single answer to that. There's no silver bullet. It really depends on what the laws are that are in place in your city, in your state beforehand, and it sort of depends on what's easiest politically. What we have seen over the years is that there have been some attempts to take on everything at once, and those tend to not pass the state legislature. But it's possible that those kind of act as beachheads for later reform, where everyone gets mad at this big bill, like what happened with SB 50 in California a few years back, that people say, okay, well, we don't want this, but the fact that this has gotten as far as it has suggests that this is a crisis we need to take action on. So this year in Colorado and Arizona, they took action after their big do-everything bills failed last year. So even then, I can't tell you with certainty that those big bills don't work or aren't helpful. But, I think in most cases, it has been a long process of trying a lot of different things and attempting a lot of different policy areas. And so I'll just put up some further reading from Mercatus on our housing supply research in case anyone is interested. And yeah, I think I will hand it over to the next panelist.
Awesome. Give a big hand to Eli. Thank you, Eli. Eli, I really learned a lot from that presentation. For everyone that's joining us today, there will be a test at the end of this, so I hope you were taking notes. You are all now experts in parking, zoning, and housing reform. Eli, real quick, are you a Giants fan? You're from San Francisco,
Yeah,
right? Okay.
yeah.
Well, it's A's are better, but you certainly, I think you got it right on the housing. So next up, we have Laura Arce, our second Bay Area resident, and I didn't invite her because she's born in Oakland, as was I, but she is a leader in the fight to connect more Latinos and other communities of color to home ownership, which obviously means that there needs to be homes for these folks to buy. Laura is a senior vice president of economic initiatives at Unidos US, which is the largest Latino civil rights organization in the country. She is the architect of Home Ownership Means Equity, the Home Initiative, a multi-year movement to transform the economic trajectory of Latinos through home ownership, and is working to enable the creation of 4 million new Latino homeowners between 2020 and 2030. Previously, Laura has held senior positions in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors, including Wells Fargo, the Federal Housing Finance Administration, and on Capitol Hill. So without further ado, Laura, I'll hand it over to you. And Laura, would you like the podium? Or? Okay, yeah, let's do it.
See if, I have pictures here. Well, thank you, Adam. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here at the inaugural event of the Alliance, the launching. So thank you guys for inviting me. So I have two goals with my time before you this morning. The first is I will hope to be able to convince you, if you're not already convinced, and I suspect many of you in this room already are, that housing supply is a civil rights issue. And the second thing I want to convey is that community-based organizations, nonprofits, are really, really important partners and stakeholders in executing the solutions that we need to execute for housing supply. So next slide, please. But I'll start by introducing Unidos US, because I'm not sure if everyone in the room is familiar with us. Unidos US is a national Latino civil rights organization. We were established in 1968. We're based here in Washington, D.C., just down the road on 16th Street is our headquarters. And we also have offices in 4 states, in California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And we are a multi-issue organization. So we really focus on closing all the gaps. So we work on education, on health, workforce and employment, housing, as well as issues around civic engagement and immigration. And the way we do our work, what I think about as like our capabilities, include policy and advocacy, applied research, communications and storytelling, as well as our national network of community-based affiliates. So these are over 300 organizations across the country who have allied with Unidos US. We have shared goals. They're working at the local level. We're supporting them at the national level. Next slide, please. So closing the Latino homeownership gap is an institutional priority for Unidos US. And this is really why. We know that Latino families have just 1/5 the wealth of white families on average. And we know that there are many drivers to that. Homeownership isn't the sole cause for that, but we know that homeownership is one of the key drivers. And we also know that Latino homeowners have 28 times the wealth of Latino renters. So there really is something there to focus on. And we believe very strongly that addressing wealth disparities in this country is one of the most critical challenges facing our nation. And housing is high, if not number one, it's at the very top of the list of solutions that we need to address the wealth disparities in this country. So next slide, please. So for our part, Unidos US last year launched the Home Ownership Means Equity initiative to transform the economic trajectory of Latino families through homeownership. And we did set a goal of helping to create 4 million new Latino homeowners this decade nationwide. The Home Initiative is a multi-year movement to make systemic change in the critical areas that we think are the big drivers to addressing homeownership opportunities. So next slide. We have 4 goals. We want to expand access to credit. We want to increase homebuyer readiness. We want to help families protect and pass on their assets to the next generation. And we want to increase housing supply, especially housing stock that it's accessible and affordable to first-time home buyers. The way we're doing this is we're leveraging 5 of Unidos' strongest capabilities. So we are making investments in communities. We are sponsoring research and data analytics to inform strong policies and market practices. We're advocating here in Washington, D.C. at the federal level, as well as in some of the key strategic states I mentioned earlier. We're also convening partners, stakeholders, new friends, bringing folks to the table, aligning people around priorities and goals, and then helping to for us to all kind of execute together toward those shared goals. And we also leverage our communications. I think storytelling is a really powerful tool. And really, our goal here is to bring more people to the movement. We want more people to recognize the importance of housing supply as a civil rights issue. We want to compel people to understand that addressing and supporting Latino homeownership is not just good for Latino communities, it's actually good for our nation. And so we really want to bring more people to the table, and communications and storytelling is a really important part of that. Unidos does a lot of polling. We frequently poll Latino voters, Latino consumers, and we have been hearing, it's not going to be any surprise to people in this room, the number one concern of Latinos right now is cost of living. And if you unpack that, it's housing specifically that is really a big concern, housing costs across the board. And we also know that the top barriers to increasing homeownership within Latino communities are affordability and housing supply inventory. So we feel strongly that to close the wealth gap, we need to close or narrow the homeownership gap. And to do that, we need to close or narrow the housing supply gap. Again, particularly of those homes that are accessible to first-time entry-level buyers. So next, I'd like to share maybe just a few examples of some of the work that we're doing that's specifically around supporting or addressing affordability and inventory. So the first thing I want to talk about is that we are investing in communities and in innovation. Last year, or actually early this year, we launched Premio Home, which is a national competition to recognize and support community-based housing supply innovations. We selected awardees from across the country. We received so many really amazing ideas. We awarded over $1 million in grants to projects in 12 states, as well as Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. Next slide, please. This is a sampling of 9 of the awardees. I'm not going to go through each of these. I know the font's a little small, sorry about that. But I do want to share just some of the big themes that we saw from the awardees, as well as just the submissions more broadly. One is climate resiliency. So there are organizations doing some really interesting things here. And so, for example, one group we're supporting in Arizona is incorporating solar panels and other climate resilient enhancements to the single-family homes that they're building in southern Arizona along the border to improve both energy efficiency as well as affordability around, we all know the rising cost of utilities, utility expenses in this country. Another organization in the Pacific Northwest is testing new timber technologies to not only take advantage of the efficiencies of modular construction in terms of speeding up the opportunity for building more homes, but they're also testing timber technologies that are more resilient to wildfire risk. So we think this is a really exciting new innovation. A second theme that we're seeing is ADUs, accessory dwelling units, certainly something a lot of organizations are focused on. So one example, an organization in California is working with homeowners in East LA to help those homeowners kind of work through some of this red tape to be able to subdivide their lot, sell their backyard casita to a new home buyer, which is now permitted under state law in California. And then if you go to the other side of the country, in North Carolina, one of the groups that we're supporting is adding an ADU to the homes that they're constructing and building for first-time home buyers on a community land trust. So you're getting not only the benefit of the permanent affordability of a community land trust model, but the ADU is helping the homeowner enhance their economic resiliency by being able to bring in more income to be able to afford their mortgage payment and other housing expenses. And then a third really interesting theme that we saw is what I call workforce homeownership. And interestingly, 2 organizations we're supporting are both doing projects that are specifically targeted at providing homeownership opportunities to educators. So we have one group in San Francisco that is building high-density homeownership in one of the toughest places to provide homeownership for first-time buyers. And they're doing this in the Mission District in San Francisco, and they're targeting public school teachers. And they're doing this in partnership with the local public school district because there's a huge shortage of teachers in San Francisco because so many teachers have been driven out of the city due to the high cost of housing. And then if you move over to the Midwest in Wisconsin, there's an organization in Milwaukee that we're supporting that is rehabbing older housing stocks. These are older houses, modest houses, about 1,000 square feet. They're rehabbing them, they're turning around, and they're selling them for $100,000 to first-time home buyers who are preschool teachers in the community. And they're working with some local preschools in the area specifically to provide these opportunities for home ownership in those communities. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening in communities across the country. We're really honored to be supporting a small part of their work, and we think it's really important to elevate these as models across the country and to bring them to national audiences such as you all. Unidos is going to be doing a series around storytelling on each of these projects over the coming months, so please stay tuned. And I'll move maybe now to the next slide to the next area that I want to talk about, and that's research. And we believe very strongly that research, data analytics are so important to inform and shape strong public policies and good, effective market practices. We're doing a series of things here, many in partnership with the Urban Institute. We established together a Latino Homeownership Research Collaborative, and there's a lot of work underway, but I did want to spotlight one thing that we did is we issued jointly a call for research papers. We issued a research agenda, what some of our big questions around Latino homeownership. We put it out there, see what the response was, and we selected 7 papers, which will be presented at a research symposium in January of 2025 here in Washington, D.C. at the Urban Institute headquarters. And interestingly, several of the papers are focused either on housing supply or kind of housing supply related, more place-based solutions. And so we have 2 papers that are looking specifically at Southern California, one in Chicago, they're looking at a community in Chicago, or in the Chicagoland area, and then another paper that's looking at the colonias along the Texas border region. And something that I think this really illustrates is that while the housing crisis is a national problem, at the end of the day, for really effective solutions, you need to have a regional lens. And so I'm really excited to see what these papers bring forward and see what we see that's different around like what we need to do in Southern California versus a Chicago suburb versus a rural area in South Texas. And so again, more to come. The research symposium will be held in January if any of you are interested. And then to the next slide, please, I'll move to the final example I wanted to share around activities supporting housing supply, and that's around advocacy. I mentioned that we have state offices in California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. I just want to give a shout out. Our teams in California and Arizona in particular have been really active and leaders in their state around advancing housing supply legislation, whether around ADUs, missing middle housing. They've done some really great work in coalition with like California Community Builders and other partners. But I wanted to share one case study from Nogales, Arizona, which is down in the Arizona border. In Nogales, the mayor of Nogales was really interested in increasing economic development, economic opportunity in his community. And when he kind of started looking at some of the options, a lot of the economic growth coming to Arizona, what he could pull to southern Arizona to his community, he quickly realized his number one barrier was housing. He needed to have housing in order to draw the employers to his community. So he reached out to us, and we helped him convene a group of stakeholders, community leaders, nonprofits, experts from Arizona State University, elected officials from the state, and lots of other partners, bring them to a table to have a conversation. And now this group that was developed ad hoc with the sponsorship of the mayor and then with our support and convening folks is now together with all of these stakeholders rewriting Nogales' zoning rules in order to facilitate more housing coming, that kind of missing middle housing coming to the community to then be able to draw more of the employers that are coming to Arizona due to all of the technology investments that are happening there in the state. So then that takes us to my last slide. So again, I just want to go back to where I started, and I hope I've made the case that housing supply is a civil rights issue, and the community organizations are really important stakeholders, both on the policy advocacy front as well as on the development and building side. And so if you want to learn more, please reach out there. And again, thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, Laura. That was really amazing, and I know that Unidos does such amazing work. So thank you for that presentation. I should also mention that if anybody is in California on October 24th, we are giving Laura an award, our inaugural Dream Builder Award for the amazing work that she's been doing. So if you're there, I hope you'll join us in Berkeley. And then next up, I'm very, very excited to bring up another person that's representing an organization that many of you may not be familiar with, but in many ways is actually the driving force behind many of the more modern conversations that we're having around housing supply advocacy. And I'm really, really excited to welcome Gillian Pressman from YIMBY Action. She is the managing director there, where she leads operations and fundraising to power the nation's largest movement of pro-housing grassroots activists. Prior to YIMBY Action, she was the Senior Director of Development at Peer Health Exchange and previously was the Executive Director at for Massachusetts at Generation Citizen. Gillian holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion from Princeton University, and I'm really excited to bring her to the podium now to just talk about her work around supporting pro-housing movements across the country. Gillian, would you like a mobile? Okay, there you go. Oh, just gotta switch on.
Hi all, excited to be here. So my slides, I have a little bit about like the what, but I think other folks have covered that, so I'm gonna breeze through that and kind of talk about the how, which is we have talked about we wanna get more housing supply. How? How do we do it? Can we just start building? No. The answer is no, we cannot. It is very hard politically, and so I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. So we're YIMBY Action. Just quick about me, if you go to the next slide. I started at YIMBY Action in San Francisco, so I'm not a Bay Area native, but I have spent time in San Francisco in that area where the housing shortage is quite catastrophic. I did move to Norfolk, Virginia, which I was like, oh, great, it's gonna be affordable here. It's a little better than San Francisco. It is not quite affordable. It is also, there's also a housing shortage there. And indeed, there's a housing shortage really in every major economic center and some just other places. There's also a housing shortage. This is a problem across the country. Who we are, we're YIMBY Action. So does anyone know what YIMBY stands for? What does it stand for? Yes, in my backyard. Great. Okay, so we are in contrast to NIMBYs who are not in my backyard. And I'm going to talk about NIMBYism a little bit. NIMBYs are not necessarily a person. NIMBYism is something in all of us that can get triggered. And NIMBYism can get very easily triggered because when we start having these conversations about building more housing, we also have to have conversations about neighborhoods changing. And people get very, very triggered by that. And I think, honestly, particularly today when climate change and global war and things are stressful, people get even more triggered. They really don't want their neighborhoods to change. Unfortunately, the neighborhoods, if we do nothing, the neighborhoods are going to change anyway. We're going to get increasing homelessness. We're going to have areas, I think folks maybe can relate to this, where the population gets older and older and richer and families move out and there's no kids and there's no teachers and there's no firefighters. The neighborhoods are going to change anyway. And so what we have to do is let's change the buildings a little bit so that we can accommodate a growing, thriving community. But NIMBYism is something that comes, it rears its ugly head, and all the strategies about how we are going to do this need to confront NIMBYism, which I'll talk about a little bit. So next slide, every state has a housing shortage. Next slide, I think this is obvious, but if you see, does anyone here come from a yellow state? Raise your hand. This is where the housing shortage is worse. Yes, California, yes, okay. Does anyone come from, let's say, a blue state? Raise your hand. Yeah, the housing shortage is also bad there. There's no state where there's not a housing shortage. So next slide. How did we get here? Breeze through this super quickly. We talked about zoning. Local governments love single family zoning. Why do they love single family only zoning? Next slide. Racism. That's really the answer, is that we worked really hard to create neighborhoods that keep certain people out. And at first we just said those people are not allowed. That was outlawed. And so then it became, well, let's just make it incredibly expensive for people that don't look like us to live in this neighborhood by saying we only can have big detached single family housing. So this is not just single family only, it's some of the stuff that Eli talked about. It's like not allowing small lots, not allowing small homes. It means requiring all this parking, these big houses with 6 cars. Like that's the kind of thing that we have legislated, and the ultimate reason is to keep people out of these communities. And it still has, as we talked about, it still has a racist effects. It still is that single family zoning disproportionately benefits white wealthy people and no one else. No signal. Okay, other reason, too much process. Eli talked about this, that it's too hard to build. This is San Francisco's nice little map about all the steps that you have to do to get something built. It's kind of poetic in its beauty, but it's ridiculous. Next slide. And then, for affordable housing, the funding, look at this graph. It has just completely shot down, kind of stayed static at a really, really, really low level and doesn't seem to be picking up. So when it comes to how do we build the really low income housing, we're not seeing the funding that we used to see for that. Even if you're just thinking about market rate housing, if you do not have enough funding for really low income housing, it ends up, there's a lot of projects that require both types of housing. It ends up killing all housing when we don't have these kind of subsidies available. We can fix this. The way to fix this is basically do the opposite of all these things. So these are some of the policies that we've talked about. And next slide, Eli did a much more in-depth overview of what state legislatures are doing. I see a lot of the work that we're doing specifically in state legislatures, a lot of the zoning type of thing, so different types of zoning. So we talked about accessory dwelling units. There's a concept called YIMBY, Yes in God's Backyard. Has anyone heard of that one? It's allowing churches, faith-based organizations, to build housing on their land. Lot of excess land from churches that have a little bit of dwindling congregations. It's a really warm and fuzzy political story because we have these really adorable church ladies that are trying to build housing. Surprisingly, it still gets a lot of opposition, but that's kind of a trend that we've seen, which is interesting. And then small lots housing in commercial zones, single stair, not quite zoning, but so some legalization. And then next slide, we're also trying to get the permit streamlining, trying to get getting rid of some of the bad incentives like the parking minimums and things like that. So we've covered this already, but these are the things that we're trying to get happen in state legislatures. What is the problem? We have these great ideas. These are really great ideas. We know there's a housing shortage. We know things that'll solve that housing shortage. Okay, what happens now? Why can't we just do it? Point 1. Housing policies will get grassroots oppositions. So we cannot just have a smart lobbyist in a room who says, hey, legislator, hey, governor, hey, mayor, look at all the data. I have a Mercatus report about all the data about how great this is. Here's a policy that will work. Why don't you pass it? Sometimes that works. So an example is in Hawaii, the governor Hawaii has a terrible housing shortage. Governor, really excited to do something about it, passed an emergency streamlining bill, so emergency streamlined a whole bunch of types of housing, and great, okay, problem solved. We just need to get like a smart governor, and great, he does it, problem solved. The amount of backlash, he had a commission that was in charge of putting that housing into effect. They got death threats, like actual death threats. People resigned. It stalled for months and months. Nothing actually happened because, again, let's talk about NIMBYism. It gets triggered. When you have something that says your communities might change, people get very angry and they start to organize. What is important to know about this is the people who start to organize and come out in opposition are not representative. So when you do polls, when you ask people, most people want housing, and most people are even okay with their neighborhood changing. It's a little grumbly. It's annoying. Construction is annoying. Nobody likes it. But most people, they want to see the benefits of abundant housing. But a very small vocal few get extremely angry and get extremely organized, and they will fight back. And so that's important to know about some of these policies, is that we can't just squeak them through. There is going to be opposition, and so we need to have a plan for that. So next slide is that, we can't have a smart lobbyist in a room. We need to have a movement. So all the majority of people who do really want to see more housing supply are totally open to having more buildings in their community to make that happen. Those people right now, not really an incentive to turn out. They say, oh, cool, there's a new law. That sounds great. Thumbs up. They're not as motivated as the people who are opposed to it. We have to get them motivated. We have to say, okay, we need you. We need your voice. And so let's get organized and let's build a movement. Another problem is that electeds, they want to keep getting elected and they want to please everybody. So if there's that one person in their constituency who really is opposed to housing because it'll change their neighborhood, the elected's like, oh, I like housing, but, only modest housing, or, let's just put it in the other neighborhood, the other person's district. Let's not put it here. Like, that is how electeds will tend, even well-meaning, even like really smart, even, really committed electeds. They want to please everyone. That's their job. So what we need to do, next slide, is we need to show them that actually the majority of people in their districts not only care about this issue, but actually will vote them out if they don't vote in the right way, and we'll vote for them if they do vote in the right way. So we actually have a political arm, a 501c4 arm, and we do endorsements, and endorsements really matter. That's really critical to this issue. We have to show electeds that we mean business. And then the last one is cities will find loopholes to our best laws. Has anyone heard of this mountain lion story? I'm seeing a few of the California folks. So there's a state law that was passed, and it was pretty modest, but it allowed lot splits. So it allowed like a lot to be split into two, and you could build homes on both sides of the lot. And then Woodside, California, wealthy enclave, said, oh, no, this is a mountain lion habitat. So we don't have to follow the law. The law doesn't apply to us because of mountain lions. Yes, it was ridiculous. And the scientists weighed in and they were like, no, mountain lions are not here. This is not an issue. But that's the kind of thing that cities will do, because the cities are catering to these really vocal constituencies that, again, do not represent what the people really want. And so what we need to do is we need to enforce the law. So we need to take action, let cities know that they are required to follow through on these laws. Sometimes we actually sue cities. We've sued a bunch of cities in California, and we're actually expanding our lawsuit division to sue that. So those are the main points. We cannot achieve this unless we get people organized to say yes, unless we, do some political work too. We can't ignore the politics, and unless we do some enforcement work. So how can you all help? And so yeah, that's our special sauce. It's not enough to be right. We have to be powerful too. We're building grassroots movement. We can skip this. I've talked about this. It's our theory of change. Skip this. Okay, what's next? What can you do? So we have some big legislative fights, and we need supporters and partners. So I think for you all, first of all, you all are individuals. You are people who can vote. You are people who can sign a petition. You're people who, even if you're feeling squirrely, can show up to public comment and say, I support this. And so we definitely all encourage you in your individual capacity to take action. This is the kind of work, sometimes a housing project hearing happens, housing gets proposed, the only people that show up is 2 to 3 disgruntled neighbors that say, I don't want my neighborhood to change. If you have one person there, one person who stands up and says, I am also in this neighborhood and I care about this housing and I want to see a community that embraces and welcomes housing and new people, it completely changes the game. Even that one person can give cover to the Planning Commission, who probably knows what's right, to say, okay, well, we're going to vote yes on it because we know it's not, the community hasn't said no. The community is much more diverse than the people who traditionally show up. So encourage you all in your personal capacity to think about that. The other thing is, as organizations, we have a corporate membership program, and typically what we do with our corporate members is collaborate on advocacy. So if you're in a particular region and you say, I want to be part of the solution to build more housing, maybe you don't have a government relations staff, maybe you don't know exactly what you should do, partnering with us is helpful because we can kind of give you the tea on what's going on, what's helpful, what you can do as an organization to plug in. Or you can just fund us to do it ourselves, which we're also happy to do. And then the other piece too is in our corporate membership is like branding and visibility. So if you want your organization to be known as an organization that cares about housing supply and that is putting your money where your mouth is, join us as a corporate partner. And we have a big party. Who are California folks? Is it this area? We have a big party. It's YIMBY prom. We're all going to prom October 5th. So if you're in the Bay Area, come out to that. But we have stuff like that. We're to try to like create visibility and momentum for folks like all of us who really believe in housing supply and see it as really important. So I'll leave you with that. Become a YIMBY Action member. Talk to me later about corporate partnership and how we can work together. And yeah, this is a big fight. It's an important fight. And I guess I want to say that it is a fight. Like it is something that we can't just start building. We have to engage in these ways. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Gillian. Now I'm pumped up to fight for some more housing. I will say the hardest part of this this presentation event, though, everyone up here can't see the slides, so we're all sort of like imagining what is up here on the screens. And before I bring up our last presenter, quick question. Who here has attended a planning event and supported a housing project? And don't be shy if you have. Okay, a few hands. Gillian, how many have you attended in your life, would you say, planning commission meetings?
30 maybe?
Yeah, so that's a lot. Yeah, so we all need to get to Gillian's number. So, last but very much not least, I'd like to invite up my very good friend and someone who I've known for a long time now. Hyepin is the CEO of Faith and Community Empowerment, based in Los Angeles, but is a national nonprofit involved in empowering churches and nonprofits to leverage their resources by building capacity, leadership, and partnerships in economic development, and serving as a bridge between the Korean, Asian, and Asian American community and the larger community at large. She's doing amazing work around training faith-based communities in affordable housing, housing counseling, and many other things. So welcome up, Hyepin. Would you like the mobile?
I'll try to stay here.
Okay,
Let's see
sounds
if it
good.
works. Good morning. Again, Hyepin with Faith and Community Empowerment. I do feel really pumped up. I feel like I'm surrounded by doers, and I'm sure that all of us, all of you in the room are the same. So again, thank you for your leadership and service. Today, again, I would like to speak on some potential pathways to homeownership and housing. Could we go to the next slide? So, you know what? It is a little bit difficult. Let me try to see if I could. So a little short introduction of our organization. I grew up as a pastor's kid, and my parents, you know, when they answered God's call, they thought they were going to go and preach the gospel, and they did plenty of that, but they also ended up becoming unpaid social workers, right? And I saw the good work that they did, but the struggle was real, and I always carried a desire, could there be a better way? I grew up and got to know Pastor Cecil Murray and Reverend Mark Whitlock at First AME Church. They were doing the same things that my parents were doing, but the difference, they had created an affiliated nonprofit, and with that, they could partner with the broader world. And boy, what an amazing impact that they had. The $3 million offering was leveraged with an additional $12 million in funding. They did affordable housing, they did venture capital, small business, health clinic, all that and more. And so I saw this model that I thought I wish I could bring to my community. Long story short, a lot of miracles happened. And today we have been serving for 23 years, connecting church and community. And as such, we have equipped over 5,000 faith leaders. We've been able to be successful in getting over 1,000 partners from White House to Fortune 500. And I've been in many rooms, you know, and I think for all of us, like, we've been there where you're in the outhouse, and then somehow God's provision, favor, lots of strategy. You somehow come into the White House or the in-house, and I think that we've experienced many of that through our 1,000 partnerships. And again, numerous initiatives, including affordable housing, capacity building, homeownership, foreclosure, and so forth, including racial solidarity as well, which I think is a very important piece of our fight as well. And again, we've trained over 10,000 home buyers to be on their way to becoming a homeowner. Next slide. And so I just want to share that there is a $380,000 difference in wealth between homeowners and renters. And that makes a huge difference in what we can do in giving people options to pursue education, start business, just have a safety net during life's many challenges as well. I know I'm preaching to the choir. So let's go to the next slide. Again, I'm preaching to the choir. Unfortunately, even though the vast majority of our middle class built their wealth through homeownership, it has excluded and left out the communities of color. And you'll see on this slide that white home ownership is at 66%. This is the most recent data that I could get where I could disaggregate data as well. And you'll see that Hispanic home ownership 48, black home ownership at 42%. The missing piece, as an Asian American in this country, there is this concept, the model minority myth, that Asians are privileged. We're free of oppression and racism, and that we're white adjacent. And if you do look at the aggregate data, it will see 62%. And so again, it looks like we are. But you know what? When you throw 40 groups and the kitchen sink, you know, there's a lot of other subgroups there that don't really get to experience that same level. And so when you disaggregate, Korean and black homeownership rate is the same at 42%. There's 7 other API subgroups below black and Korean homeownership rate, and 12 API subgroups that are below the Hispanic homeownership rate of 48%. So again, I think we're all in the same boat. Racism, it doesn't discriminate who it discriminates against, right? And so I think, again, we're here about power. Was it about power, right? That we need power for all of us. And so let's go to the next slide. I do want to share, from California's perspective, $800,000 is the median price, home price. You know, I don't know about you, but there aren't that many of us that could afford an $800,000 home price. The good news, though, is that particularly with the special purpose credit programs, and I don't know if some of you are aware, I think I'm preaching to the choir, but in essence, a lot of banks are introducing this initiative targeting basically and servicing groups that have been left behind for whatever reason. It doesn't have to be race, but definitely race is one category. And as such, between the different down payment assistance program provided by government, and in the city of LA, $161,000 could be given. You layer it with another $100,000 from Cal Homes. You layer it with another $30,000 from Wish, which is a 4-to-1 match, and then you layer it with another assistance from banks from $10,000. And I'm going to tell you a secret. It's going to be announced soon. Can't name the bank, but the bank is going to announce sometime this week $50,000 of down payment assistance. So when you layer all that, it's $340,000. We helped a client the other day. We did the math. They were earning $80,000, but because of their debt to income ratio, the amount of loan that they would have gotten was about $240,000. Well, you know what? Again, you can't buy much of a house in California, but when we layered it with that $340,000, she was very happy. And I have to say that I see many clients with credit challenges, but when we share this path, you know, they become very motivated. You know, all those, debt balances that they had written off, that's all shown up in their credit report, you know, that they probably wasn't going to deal with. When we say, hey, you know what? If you deal with this and you can negotiate, this is what you could do. You could get that $340,000 additional assistance. You could be a homeowner. I see them really pumped up. So even for people who've had all these past challenges, when you give them hope, there is a pathway. And so again, whether it's the Was it 3 million or 4 million? 4 million, right? There are, again, we're serving all people, right? And so the next slide, you'll be able to see Cain Rivera. We were able to help him. He only earned, 35,000, 22 years old. And he only put out $2,900. ABC7 came to cover him, and basically his mortgage payment was less than his rent payment. And I have many more stories to share of that. I didn't get to highlight in the earlier slide that with the special purpose credit program, there's like no down payment, no closing costs. I mean, like, it's an amazing day. And again, that is part of the policy work and advocacy to continue to support those activities. Let's go on. So again, in California, again, housing shortage everywhere. Supposedly, we need 2.5 million, but California is only building 70 to 100,000 a year. So huge, huge gap. And so literally, our towns have really changed over the years. So let's go on. One big solution, houses of worship, right? Earlier, you mentioned about all these zoning rules and requirements, et cetera. And so there's, in the spaces that we want to build houses or housing, there's limited land, and it's very expensive. But thankfully, churches are someone who owns land, and there was a study done just for California alone, and there's 47,000 acres of land that potentially is qualified to build affordable housing. It is an amazing opportunity that exists, and because it will allow, part of, again, around affordable housing is that the holding cost of land could be very expensive until you get that financing. But churches, they're already sitting on it. So it is something that's very powerful that churches have that could be a great asset in terms of this challenge. And I know that there's some new laws that are legislation that's being introduced. So it's not just affordable housing for tax credits, but also tax credits for home ownership as well. So it is an exciting opportunity. Let's go on. I was going to put a title, but you know, in every hard challenges of life, there's a potential silver lining. And for the country and for churches, the pandemic had a huge, huge impact in terms of they weren't allowed to congregate. So there was declining attendance, which means also declining offering. And basically, they're sitting on empty buildings and parking lots. And I think someone mentioned, you know, in NIMBYism, it's not just like a person, but it's in all of us. I wouldn't equate the same, but church people, religious people, they have a huge attachment to their real estate. It's not just a building, but really the history, the legacy, their faith, all that is tied to it. And so very few churches ever want to sell or release that land. However, with the pandemic, they're now in desperate times and desperate measures. They are believers, but you know, they're looking for options. And so this is this really valuable window of opportunity. There's been studies that show over 100,000 churches right now could potentially close and shut their doors. So they are a potential sitting, potential viable partner in this solution. So next slide. Again, earlier people mentioned about zoning. You know what? It's so hard to get the churches to come to the table, but when they do, they get hit with zoning approval requirements. It's expensive, not guaranteed, and time consuming. So you know what? The very few that get there, the zoning approval just kills them. But thankfully, for California, SB4 has allowed churches, education institutions, and hospitals to not have to go through zoning approval, and it's a streamlining process. I mean, they do need to still meet other requirements, but it is a huge, huge lift. And I know that, again, there's current legislation right now to make that national, and I'm very hopeful that that will happen. Next slide. But the dilemma, again, even after the zoning approval, church people, they're not equipped. there might be people even in their own congregation, but most pastors don't know that those people even exist in their congregation. So again, they don't know what's possible. They don't know who to trust. There's lack of transparency in this field, lack of expertise. You know, they don't even know what to ask for, etc. There's a lot of fear as well because there have been corruption and past, abuse as well, and just lack of funds. But this is where, again, there's a missing piece. In all the affordable housing training for faith leaders that I've gone to, they focus on the nuts and bolts. It's like buying a car, and the sales agent will talk about how the engine was built. I don't need that. Church people don't need that. 99% of that training, the developers will handle. What church people need is this good news, that basically their empty buildings and parking lots are assets that they could leverage, and they don't have to sell their land to get that money. They're about to close their doors, right? They're going to have to sell their property, but instead of selling, they could do a ground lease and get the same amount of money to continue to keep their church doors open. And instead, they will get the inflow funds. They could do good and help people. Zero minimal upfront out-of-pocket cost, and they could bring new life to their congregation, and there's a possibility of owning that land after the building after 15 years, potentially. Let's go on. So again, more good news. They don't have to have the funds or the expertise. 99% of that work will be done by developers, and they could secure financing, no minimal out-of-pocket costs, and the property management and all that other stuff can be done by the developer. How many of you have heard development that way? You know what? I haven't either. And so I'm on a movement, a campaign, and with the LA County, when they did their faith-based affordable housing, they reached out to us to say, can you bring faith leaders? And I said, you know what, if it's gonna be more of the same, instead of motivating them, you're gonna kill their motivation. And so we partnered together, did some training, and you know what, it got recorded. Enterprise just recently called me to say, I liked your training, let's see how we can work together, right? So again, this is the kind of training that we need. I want to give you a couple of examples of what's, again, missing. Here is a church, right? And this church, they had 2.2 acres of land. I can't even see this right now. But they were able to build 47 units, right? And basically the total cost was, gosh, terrible, 12 million. Not terrible, but 12 million, my vision is bad, right? And their ground lease is 60 years. They had zero out of upfront expenses, and they were able to get the kind of payment of $500,000, $100,000 a year for 5 years, but they got a new building and new landscaping, and again, the impetus was the fact that they were gonna close their doors, right? Let's see, oops. Next example. Another church here in Santa Ana, they had, oh my gosh, can you guys read it? How many acres of land is that? 1.7 acres, right? But anyway, you could see the data, right? So again, the thing is that what's missing is that churches don't know what is possible. We spent significant amount of time to do this kind of research and lay it out. But we need more investments of this kind of research with transparency to inspire churches to come on board. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so like I said, what is missing is raising awareness to pastors and saying it just the way I said. Zero out of pocket, zero expertise. You could get the same amount of money for selling the land, but instead you just do a ground lease. And you could keep the building, right? And then, again, the transparency of examples. Last piece is the pre-development training and guidance. So once the church is ready, the developer could handle the pre-development and the development, take it all the way home. But what is missing is, again, the awareness, and then walking with the churches to look at their land and do a site analysis and giving them that guidance. That kind of funding is missing as well. So I really want to advocate for those pieces. Last but not least, State of California, the state treasurer Fiona Ma has created a BIPOC fund for BIPOC developers so that they could compete on their own. So that's a great piece. In California, for about a year, they had an ADU fund giving $40,000 to people who wanted to do so. That funding has ended, but again, more campaign as well. The governor has filed lawsuits against cities who are playing those games. And so again, yay, Governor Newsom, right? Let's see. And I do sit on many local and national advisory councils, Freddie Mac's Affordable Housing Advisory Council. Like I said, that was one group. I went from the outhouse to the in-house, to Fannie Mae, to the NHC, National Housing Conference, Racial Equity Work Group. Our HUD intermediary, Home Free USA, Marcia Griffin is here. And so again, we are doing a lot of work locally and nationally. And the last piece is that for pastors, they have this tremendous potential. They're doing good work. They own the land, but they are also doing good work. But in terms of their voice and their power to engage them, they need to be equipped how to do community engagement, how to do community partnership, how to do community development. And our C2 Leadership Institute allows that. It's a 15-week boot camp. And I've seen in many situations where the pastor suddenly says, you mean I have to be nice to those elected officials, right? And so again, it is an amazing path that I believe that with pastors and faith congregations coming on board, they could be a great part of the solution. And so we look forward to partnering with you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Hyepin, for closing us out with the spirit. I think that's the way that it needed to happen. So we are over time, everybody, but I do know that we've had a lot of great information shared on a lot of different topics, even if it's all under the same umbrella. Before we call it a wrap, does anybody have a question that they would like to bring to our panelists before we call it? And if not, that's okay, because again, we are a little bit over time. So if it's okay with our panelists, if you don't have to rush off, we'd love to invite you to stay for lunch. And if folks have questions, they can tap you in, and you can share information that way. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give it back to Marcos.
I love to exchange business cards. My car's downstairs, so I don't have to do that. But I'd love to collaborate more of these opportunities.
And so I think what we're going to do is go ahead and take about a 45-minute break, and then we're going to come back for lunch, or we're going to have lunch. And then at 12:15, we're going to welcome our great friend Richard Rothstein to come up and speak to us later. So thank you again, everybody. Yep.